The Mormons just wanted to be left alone. That's a simple way to put it, but it's pretty close to the truth. They had been moving around for years, from New York to Ohio to Missouri, then Illinois. Each time, they faced trouble. People didn't like their beliefs. They didn't like how Mormons lived. They especially didn't like how Mormons stuck together. It was a tight-knit community. This made others suspicious. Their founder, Joseph Smith, was even killed by a mob. This happened in Illinois. After that, Brigham Young took charge. He was a strong leader. He decided they needed to go somewhere truly isolated, somewhere no one else wanted. That place was Utah. It was dry, far away, and seemed perfect for building their own society. So, thousands of them packed up everything. They crossed vast plains. It was a huge journey. They called it the Exodus. They went to a place then called Deseret, which became Utah Territory. This journey started in 1846. It took years for everyone to get there. They settled in the Great Salt Lake Valley. This was technically Mexican territory at first, but after the Mexican-American War, it became U.S. land. The U.S. got vast new territories in the west. This included Utah. The Mormons had hoped to find a sanctuary. They wanted to escape the reach of the U.S. government and people who hated them, but that wasn't going to happen. The U.S. government still claimed the land. Brigham Young quickly organized the community. He was both a religious and a political leader. He was like a prophet and a governor all rolled into one. He had immense authority. He helped them build farms and cities in the desert. They made the desert bloom. This was a huge accomplishment. He called their new home Deseret. It was meant to be God's kingdom on earth. In 1849, they asked Congress to make Deseret a state. They wanted to join the Union as a state. This would give them more control over their own affairs. But Congress had other ideas. They didn't want a Mormon state. Instead, in 1850, Congress created the Utah Territory. Brigham Young was appointed the first territorial governor. This was a compromise. The U.S. government still wanted to keep an eye on them. They didn't trust the Mormons fully. So the Mormons had a governor who was also their church president. This meant church and state were deeply intertwined. This was a big issue for many people back east. They believed in a clear separation. But for the Mormons, their whole society was built on their faith. Brigham Young's leadership was central to this. He was seen by his followers as a prophet. His word was law in their community. Other officials were appointed by the U.S. government. These were called Gentile officials. Gentile meant non-Mormon. These officials were sent to Utah to help govern the territory. They were supposed to uphold U.S. law, but they often clashed with Brigham Young. They clashed with the Mormon system. They didn't like how much power the church had. They didn't like how the Mormons ran things. The Mormons had their own courts. They had their own laws. They largely ignored the federal officials. They saw the federal officials as outsiders. They saw them as trying to undermine their way of life. This was a problem brewing for years. The federal government thought Brigham Young was overstepping his authority. They thought he was acting more like an independent ruler than a territorial governor. And then there was polygamy. This was a big one. Polygamy is when a man has multiple wives. The Mormon Church openly practiced it. They called it plural marriage. It was a core part of their faith for some time. It was a controversial practice. It was shocking to most Americans. They saw it as immoral. They saw it as barbaric. The Republican Party even called polygamy and slavery twin relics of barbarism. This practice fueled a lot of the anti-Mormon sentiment. It made it harder for them to be accepted. It gave people a reason to fear them. The federal officials who came to Utah often reported back about polygamy. They also reported about how Brigham Young seemed to control everything. They said he had too much power. They said federal law was not being enforced. These reports painted a picture of a rebellious territory. A territory run by a religious dictator. This was the stage set for conflict. The Mormons felt they were just living their faith. The U.S. government felt they were defying federal authority. The roots of the Utah War ran deep. They weren't just about a single event. It was a mix of different things. It was about federal authority versus a strong religious community. It was about law and order. It was about a religious practice that most Americans found offensive. One major issue was Brigham Young's immense power. He was both the governor and the president of the Mormon Church. For the Mormons, this made perfect sense. They believed God spoke through him, so his word carried immense weight. It was obeyed without question by most Mormons, but for the federal government, this was a problem. They saw it as a mixing of church and state that shouldn't happen. They saw it as a challenge to their authority. They believed the U.S. government should be in charge, not a religious leader. Federal judges and other officials were sent to Utah. They were supposed to set up a federal court system. They were supposed to enforce U.S. laws. But These officials often felt powerless. They felt ignored. The Mormon community had its own courts. These courts were based on church law. They were run by local bishops and church leaders. Most Mormons preferred to use these courts. They trusted them more. They saw federal judges as outsiders. So federal judges would try to hold court, but sometimes no one would show up. Or juries would be all Mormon. These juries would often side with Mormon defendants. This made it very hard for federal law to be enforced. These judges became very frustrated. They felt like they were in a foreign country. They reported back to Washington, D.C. They said Utah was in a state of rebellion. They said Brigham Young was a tyrant. They said federal authority was openly defied. Another big flashpoint was polygamy. As mentioned, the Mormon Church practiced plural marriage. This was a very public practice in Utah. Most Americans saw it as morally wrong. It was a huge scandal in the East. Newspapers talked about it constantly. Politicians condemned it. The federal government saw it as something they needed to stamp out. They saw it as against the laws of the land. But for the Mormons, it was a sacred practice. They believed it was a commandment from God. They believed it was necessary for salvation. They were not going to give it up easily. This difference in belief was irreconcilable. It created a deep divide. It made it hard for either side to understand the other. There were also specific incidents that made things worse. Some federal officials grew so frustrated that they just left Utah. They abandoned their posts. These became known as the runaway officials. They went back east and told tales of Mormon defiance. They claimed their lives were in danger. They claimed Brigham Young ran a theocracy that ignored all federal laws. One specific event involved a judge named W. Drummond. He left Utah in 1857. He claimed Mormons burned federal court records. He claimed Mormons harassed him. He claimed Brigham Young controlled everything. He even left his wife in Utah and claimed he feared for her life. Later, it turned out he had left his wife because he was living with a prostitute. And the court records were not burned. But his dramatic stories still got a lot of attention. They fed into the idea that Utah was out of control. Another issue was land ownership. The Mormons had settled in Utah. They had made a lot of improvements. They had built towns and farms. They felt this land was theirs by right of settlement, but the U.S. government still owned the land. There was no clear system for land titles. This created tension. Federal land surveyors sometimes came into conflict with Mormon settlers. The Mormons also had a strong sense of community. They had a militia called the Nauvoo Legion. This was their local defense force. Brigham Young controlled it. It was very well organized. For the Mormons, it was necessary for their protection. They had faced mobs and violence in the past. They didn't want it to happen again. But for the federal government, this armed militia under Brigham Young's control looked like another sign of rebellion. It looked like a private army, and there was a general feeling of distrust. Mormons remembered past persecutions. They believed the federal government often did little to protect them. They believed the federal government was biased against them. The federal government, on the other hand, saw Mormons as clannish and secretive. They saw them as a group that put church law above national law. This deep mutual suspicion made any resolution difficult. It made open conflict almost inevitable. The stage was set for President James Buchanan to make a decision. President James Buchanan took office in 1857. He heard all the reports from the runaway officials. He read the newspaper stories about Mormon polygamy and defiance. He probably believed them. He was a new president. He wanted to show he was strong. He wanted to assert federal authority. He saw Utah as a territory in open rebellion. Buchanan decided to act. He didn't want to deal with a state that seemed to ignore U.S. laws. He also felt pressured by public opinion. Many people in the East wanted the federal government to do something about the Mormons. So he made a big decision. He decided to send an army to Utah. This army would escort a new governor. It would establish federal authority. It would make sure U.S. laws were followed. He appointed Alfred Cumming as the new territorial governor. He removed Brigham Young from his position. This was a clear sign. The federal government was taking control. But Buchanan did not officially notify Brigham Young of this. He didn't send a letter or a messenger. He just sent an army. This was a huge mistake. It made the Mormons feel even more threatened. They heard rumors. They believed the army was coming to destroy them. The army Buchanan sent was quite large. It was called the Utah Expedition. It had about 2,500 soldiers. It was commanded by Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston. This was a significant force for the time. It was a third of the entire U.S. Army. It marched from Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, towards Utah. The journey was long and hard. It started in the summer of 1857. Buchanan's decision was based on bad information. He listened to the exaggerated reports. He didn't investigate thoroughly. He didn't send an envoy to talk to Brigham Young. He just assumed the worst. This made the conflict worse before it even began. He thought the Mormons were in rebellion. He thought they needed to be put down. The army's march was slow. They faced bad weather. They faced difficult terrain. This gave the Mormons time to prepare. Brigham Young heard about the army. He saw it as an invasion. He believed the U.S. government wanted to destroy his people. He called on all Mormons to prepare to defend themselves. He declared martial law in Utah. He told his people to not let the army enter the Salt Lake Valley. Mormon scouts watched the army's progress. They reported back to Brigham Young. The Mormons started to prepare their defenses. They planned a strategy of nonviolent resistance and harassment. They didn't want to fight a pitched battle. They knew they couldn't win against a well-equipped U.S. army, but they could make the army's life very difficult. The army itself had supply problems. It was a huge logistical challenge to move so many men and supplies across the plains. This was an advantage for the Mormons. They knew the land, they were already settled there. As the army moved west, winter approached. This made things even harder for the soldiers. The weather turned very cold, snow started to fall, the army struggled to keep its supplies moving. This was part of the Mormon strategy. They knew the harsh environment could be their best weapon. Now, Colonel Johnston was a capable officer, but he was marching into an unknown situation. He was dealing with a civilian population that considered themselves under attack. He was also dealing with a lack of clear orders. Buchanan just told him to enforce federal authority. But what that meant exactly was open to interpretation. The whole situation was a big misunderstanding. The federal government believed the Mormons were rebelling. The Mormons believed the federal government was coming to persecute and destroy them. Both sides acted based on these beliefs, and these beliefs led them straight to the brink of war. The army kept marching, the Mormons kept preparing, the stage was set for a confrontation. When Brigham Young heard about the approaching army, he reacted strongly. He saw it as a hostile invasion. He remembered all the past persecutions. He believed the government was coming to kill his people or drive them out again. He had to protect his community. He declared martial law in Utah Territory. This meant he put the territory under military rule. He ordered the Nauvoo Legion, the Mormon militia, to prepare for defense. He told them to stop the army from entering the Salt Lake Valley. But he didn't want a full-scale battle. He wanted to delay the army. He wanted to harass them. He wanted to make them turn back. The Mormon strategy was based on making the land their ally. They sent out their militia, led by Colonel Lot Smith, to harass the army's supply trains. They knew the army needed food, blankets, and equipment. Without these, the army couldn't survive the harsh winter in the mountains. Mormon militia members burned supply wagons. They drove off cattle. They destroyed forts the army had built along the trail. They stampeded army horses and mules. They made it impossible for the army to get its supplies. They didn't engage in direct combat. They just made life miserable for the soldiers. One famous event was the burning of 3 large supply trains in October 1857. This was a huge blow to the army. They lost vital supplies. This meant they couldn't make it to Salt Lake City before winter. They had to stop short. They had to hunker down for the winter in a place called Fort Bridger. The winter was brutal. The army suffered from the cold and lack of supplies. Many soldiers got sick. Many animals died. This strategy worked. It stopped the army from advancing. It prevented a direct confrontation at that time. But during this period, something much darker happened. It's important to talk about it, even though it wasn't a direct part of the Utah war fighting. This was the Mountain Meadows Massacre. In September 1857, a group of Arkansas immigrants was traveling through southern Utah. They were on their way to California. They were called the Fancher-Baker Party. There was a lot of fear and paranoia in Utah at the time. The Mormons believed the U.S. Army was coming to destroy them. They had been told to prepare for war. Many felt isolated and under attack. Some of the rhetoric from Brigham Young and other leaders was very strong. It talked about blood atonement, meaning that some sins could only be atoned for by shedding the sinner's blood. This created a very charged atmosphere. The Fancher-Baker Party was seen with suspicion. There were rumors they had harmed Mormons in the past. There were rumors they were hostile. Some local Mormon leaders and Paiute Native Americans attacked the immigrant train. They laid siege to it for several days. Eventually, a local Mormon militia leader, John D. Lee, approached the immigrants under a flag of truce. He promised them safe passage if they surrendered their weapons. The immigrants, desperate, agreed. But once they were disarmed and separated, the Mormon militia and their Paiute allies attacked them. Almost all of the adults and older children were killed. Only 17 young children, too young to tell what happened, were spared. Over 120 people died. This massacre was not ordered by Brigham Young, but it happened in an atmosphere of heightened fear and hostility that he helped create. It stained the reputation of the Mormon Church for years, and it gave the federal government even more reason to be suspicious of Mormons. It showed how fear and isolation could lead to terrible violence. Brigham Young did not find out about the full extent of the massacre right away. When he did, he sent word for the perpetrators to be punished, but it took many years for justice to be served. Only John D. Lee was eventually executed for his role in the massacre. So, while the Mormon militia was effectively stopping the U.S. Army from advancing, a dark event unfolded in the South. The Utah War, in its military sense, was a Cold War. It was about delaying and harassing. But the broader context of fear and suspicion led to real bloodshed at Mountain Meadows. The winter stopped the army, but the tensions were still very high. Both sides were preparing for what might come in the spring. The Utah War didn't end with a big battle. It ended with negotiations and diplomacy. This was partly because of the harsh winter. Colonel Johnston's army was stuck at Fort Bridger. They were cold, hungry, and demoralized. They couldn't move forward. This bought time. President Buchanan realized that his approach of just sending an army without communication was a mistake. He also faced criticism back east for the high cost of the expedition. The war was expensive. It was also unpopular with some. He needed a way to resolve the conflict without full-scale war. So he sent 2 peace commissioners to Utah. Their names were Thomas L. Kane and Alfred Cumming. Kane was a non-Mormon who had a good relationship with Brigham Young. He was sent as a mediator. Cumming was the new governor Buchanan had appointed. Their job was to try and make peace. Kane traveled ahead of Cumming. He went to Salt Lake City in early 1858. He met with Brigham Young. He explained the government's intentions. He told Young that the army was not there to destroy the Mormons. It was there to install a new governor and enforce federal law. Brigham Young, however, was still very wary. He had been through too much. He didn't fully trust the government. But Kane was a persuasive speaker. He helped bridge the gap. He convinced Brigham Young that there was a chance for peace. He helped Young see that resisting the army might lead to even worse outcomes. In April 1858, Alfred Cumming arrived in Salt Lake City. He came without the army. He came with only a small escort. This was a very brave move. It showed he wasn't just another military commander. He came as a civilian governor. Brigham Young met him. They talked. Young formally relinquished his position as governor. He accepted Cumming as the new territorial governor. Cumming then inspected the city. He saw that the Mormons were not in open rebellion. He saw that they were preparing to leave, though. Brigham Young had ordered a move south. This was a strategy to evacuate Salt Lake City and other northern settlements. The Mormons were ready to burn their homes and farms if the army tried to take them over. They would rather destroy their property than let the army have it. This showed their determination. It also showed the army would face an empty, burnt city if they continued. Governor Cumming realized the situation was more complex than Buchanan had been led to believe. He saw that the Mormons were not necessarily rebellious, but deeply distrustful and protective of their faith and community. He wrote back to Buchanan. He said the Mormons were not defying federal law in the way the runaway officials had claimed. With the new governor in place, a resolution was reached. Buchanan issued a proclamation in April 1858. He offered a pardon to the Mormons for any past acts of defiance as long as they submitted to federal authority. Brigham Young accepted the pardon. In June 1858, the U.S. Army, under Colonel Johnston, finally marched through Salt Lake City. But it was a peaceful march. They didn't occupy the city. They marched through to a place called Camp Floyd, about 40 miles southwest of the city. There, they established a permanent base. This was a compromise. The army was in Utah, but not in the Mormon capital. The move south was canceled. The Mormons returned to their homes. The Utah War was over without a major battle. It was a war of nerves, of logistics, and eventually of diplomacy. The immediate aftermath saw an uneasy peace. The army remained at Camp Floyd for a few years. It was a constant reminder of federal power. Federal officials continued to work in the territory, but Governor Cumming was much more diplomatic than his predecessors. He tried to work with the Mormons, not against them. However, the underlying tensions didn't just disappear. Polygamy remained a major issue. The federal government continued to push against it for decades. It eventually led to more conflicts and legal battles in the late 19th century. The Mormon Church officially abandoned plural marriage in 1890. This was a major step towards Utah becoming a state in 1896. The Utah War had a lasting impact. It showed the federal government's commitment to asserting its authority over the territories. It showed the Mormon people's resilience and their willingness to defend their way of life. It also highlighted the difficulties of integrating a unique religious community into the broader American society. It was a complex conflict born of misunderstanding, fear, and deeply held beliefs on both sides. But in the end, cooler heads and a bit of good fortune prevented a much bloodier outcome.